wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what a decision might be like, and so what kind of issues do our decision makers grapple with. So here are 2 examples, and we also have the case study that we discussed this morning on Pakistan with the heat wave. So here the first one is Nigeria flooding, alert 265. So these are both from last month, where river levels were rising and were continuing to rise. And as you can see on the figures, there are up to 141,000 displaced people. And rainfall was continuing, and our members had asked if they could have up to £400,000 to respond to that crisis. The other example, which was also mentioned this morning, was DRC, so in Congo, with the volcano in Goma. I won't read through the slide, but I can just give you a little bit of a sample of the type of information our decision makers have to look at and have to grapple with. And so a lot of the questions they'll ask is, first of all, should we respond to this crisis? Should we allocate funding to it? So in the first case for Nigeria, they said no. Actually, the scale is too large for the START fund, and there seemed to be more funding coming online. But you can imagine that it's quite a difficult decision to make when you have such high numbers of people at risk. In the second example, like we said this morning, actually the decision makers decided to go ahead with the alert. But once they do decide to go ahead with the alert, the question becomes how much money to disperse. In the second example for Goma, you see there's actually a range requested, £100,000 to £150,000. What's an appropriate amount to disperse to a crisis? Is it 100,000? Is it 150,000? Is it more? Is it less? So that's, again, one of the biggest issues that we have is trying to understand what is a sufficient amount of funding to disperse. And finally, what if the crisis doesn't occur as predicted? So I think with the volcano example, we do hope that it will happen. But in that case, what about the sustainability of these activities? A lot of the projects are quite short, typically 45 days. With anticipation, they can be a bit longer. But if the crisis doesn't occur within those 45 days, what does that mean about the mechanism? So I just wanted to quickly get you a sense of what it looks like to be in the shoes of our decision makers, because I think it's quite useful where you can see now there is a mix of uncertainty and risk. Uncertainty because, one, we're making decisions in the early stages of a crisis when there is limited information available, and of course, in anticipation, there's a lot more uncertainty inherent as well. So our project originally was looking a lot more at the anticipation alerts because of the uncertainty within, but very quickly we realized that it was really pervasive throughout all of our decisions. So again, like Tobias mentioned, anticipation alerts are only about 10% of the alerts we receive. The large majority are for responses to a crisis that's already occurring and unfolding. And I guess maybe just to quickly wrap up before Toby continues, I think we've really seen a lot of value added with this partnership because, of course, the humanitarian needs really far outweigh the funding available, and so we want to be as efficient as possible. And part of that is becoming more comfortable with uncertainty. And so a lot of the project, as you'll see and as Toby will describe, it was about making some small changes in our processes, but the biggest element was really a change in the mindset that our decision makers had to adopt. And we tried to find practical ways to approach that so that they can become a bit more comfortable differentiating between uncertainty and risk in the day-to-day decisions that they have to make. So that was just a very brief introduction. I'll hand it back to Toby, and then Sarah will also talk about how we've operationalized these recommendations in our activities.
Thank you so much, Melina. I think that was a wonderful overview. So, as an academic coming sort of to an organization, right, one of the questions that you're faced with is, what can you actually do there? And sort of how does your background as an academic help you help them, right? And sort of myself, I'm a trained political economist and a trained philosopher. And at least, for the political economy part, actually I have been trained mostly in things that are not applicable here, right? And now it so turns out that I sort of also used to work in the finance sector, so there's some more applicable stuff there, but there's a real threshold to be overcome for sort of academics to actually go into our organizations, and I think sort of David already touched upon this, right? And so there's particularly sort of two things I sort of want to point out that are sort of dangers from the outset, right? Where, sort of the cartoon on the right, where one person is slumped on their desk, completely destroyed, and the colleague saying, you know, it doesn't do you any good to be depressed about your job because you're stuck doing it for the rest of your life, right? That may be a correct assessment of the situation, but it might not be the most helpful way of A, communicating it, or a constructive way of what to actually do about it, right? So I think there can be a lot of research that correctly identifies what the problems are, but then it's very short on actually constructive feedback of how do you go about actually making this better, right? And then sort of the second danger, and that's sort of the economist in me speaking, right, is there can be a tendency to build very beautiful models, very, very complicated models, to show something that's very, very obvious, right? And so we have the picture on the right about this pregnancy test. You know, when you want to be sure, it's a pregnancy test that's going to predict that somebody's pregnant, even though it's pretty clear that this woman is pregnant, right? And sort of these, I think, sort of at least sort of from my background, some of the dangers that are to be avoided. One of the particular things, and we've already had about this morning, but I do want to touch upon it again, right, is sort of the predominance of some kind of optimal choice framework, right? And in economics, basically all, you know, what Lenny called the amusement part of optimal solutions, right? All economists generally are within that space. And it's a space that's incredibly unhelpful for organizations for a variety of reasons, right? And the first is that you're maximizing one variable, say profit output, subject to some constraints, but all organizations have different goals, right? And often it's a question about, in this particular crisis, for this particular thing, which goal do we care more about? Do we care more about being quicker, or do we care more about getting the quality right? Do we care more about, you know, saving more lives per dollar, or do we care about saving more lives? Do we care about having a spread of, you know, we've had lots and lots of alerts in Africa, we haven't done anything in Asia, maybe we ought to do something in Asia as well. And there just isn't one measure that you could optimize upon, right? So that's sort of the first thing is, and the second thing, obviously we touched upon this already, right, is that you can only optimize if you pretend you know everything in the future, right? But obviously you can't be known because there's limitations of data, there's sort of all sorts of other things, and as a result of this, and I think this comes back to, you know, couldn't you just build a utility function? And I think you could build a utility function after the fact, but this one utility function would be no use in making any other decisions. Because, right, you'd calibrate it on all of your priorities for this particular problems, which might not be the priorities for the next problem, right? So I think it's a question about what you'd want to do with that function. I mean, we talked about this already a little bit, right? And I just want to sort of reiterate that, right, there's often a wish that somehow uncertainty could be reduced to risk, right? That yes, if only we have Lenny talked about, if only if we make the model a little bit better, or if only we have a little bit more data, then really we have risk characteristic and not uncertainty characteristics, right? And sort of in the heatwave example, obviously, what Lenny talked about, right, is like, well, we sort of have an optimal framework for action, but then it doesn't tell you what you should do, right? It doesn't tell you whether you should act or you shouldn't act, but then other variables will have to come to, right? So one of the particular problems that START also faces with, right, is you have certain phenomena, right, such as heat waves or flood, that have characteristics that are stable over time, and there is sort of some rough optimality in sort of, you know, what you can say, but then there's no optimality in what you should do with that, right? Maybe there's no money available at the moment, so you can't do anything. Maybe there's some other reasons, right? So what I found is that that's something practitioners really struggled with, right? That on the one hand, there are these things we know. On the other hand, there are these things we don't know. But then the two also interact. And what does that interaction make with them, right? I think that was something really difficult. Sort of inflecting upon that, right, as we sort of working on this, this has really, really crucial implications for mistakes and expertise, right? And I think this is sort of one of the crucial takeaways for organizations. And if you're thinking about organizational structures, right? And Melina something mentioned upon it, right? As we were progressing with the project, right? We came to realize that, you know, given the vast difference in problems START deals with, given all the different constraints they face, the different goals they have, right? We're never gonna sort of lie out a catalog of here's what you should do in each phrase, right? So that it became more about what is the right mindset to come to those problems with, right? So we thought about a lot, and, you know, sort of much of, in some sense, that's hard to correct. A lot of the work was in conversations between myself, Melina, Sarah, other members of the staff, where you simply discussed and helped them think about, what are their priorities, what are the different things, how do they treat mistakes in an organization, right? Do they need to be more honest with themselves? Sort of these kinds of questions, right? And sort of, this is something that always comes back, right? Because under risks, expertise is simply the ability to do some mathematical calculations, and then you implement the result of those calculations into some decision procedures, and then you follow your courses of action, right? And if you think about expertise as the ability to do that really well, that's a particular kind of skill, right? And in that kind of framework, mistakes shouldn't happen, right? Because if a mistake happens, you've either calculated wrong, you've done the wrong decision procedure, or you haven't had the discipline to follow what you said you were going to do, right? And so all mistakes are kind of bad, right? They seem sort of one-off things, right? But under uncertainty, because you cannot possibly know all of these different factors, uncertainty must happen. They are guaranteed to happen. So the question becomes, how do we as an organization deal with mistakes? Or how does an organization deal with mistakes? And what sort of do they learn from them, right? And an argument could be made, and has been made by many, right, that part of what expertise is the ability to, both cope with and learn from these mistakes and sort of build intuition, right, some of which cannot be vocalized into the future. And I'm sort of going to come back on the intuition point in a bit. Now, we've heard a little bit about uncertainty, but I just want to sort of point out that, this whole discussion about uncertainty is also known under a different nomer, and that's that of the wicked problem. And the wicked problem is due to somebody, actually I believe he was an architect, I think a Ritter, and who basically said, there's this, basically his charge was that science only deals with lame problems, right? Planners and sort of people working in organizations, they deal with something called wicked problems. And wicked problems are those which are ill-formulated, where the information is confusing, where there are many clients and decision makers with conflicting values, and where the ramifications in the whole systems are thoroughly confusing, right? And sort of the takeaway point is that START suffers from some seriously wicked problems in everything they do. And maybe just sort of, I don't want to dwell too long on this, but sort of just to go over and give you some things. So Ritter basically, and if you haven't read the paper, it's sort of dilemmas for a general theory of planning. It's sort of really worth going back to because it was published 50 years ago. And in a certain sense, we haven't really come further than Ritter was, right? And that already tells you sort of something about the state of academia, maybe, right? But the first thing is basically there's no definite formulation of a wicked problem, right? Because it basically depends what you're interested in, right? There's no stopping rule, right? Unlike a differential equation, which once you solved it, you never quite, even if you had a solution, you don't know that you do in fact have the solution, and you probably don't, right? And also, we've heard a bit about this, solutions are not true or false, but good or bad, right? There's no immediate test or ultimate test for a solution, right? You never really know that you arrived there. All attempts to solution have effects that may not be reversible or forgettable, right? So once the START fund tries out a new way of doing things into the committee, that's going to influence how the committee reacts in the future, right? And there's no perfect way of simulating. If we introduce one way of doing this in the START fund, right, we have no START fund laboratory with perfect START fund agents. And also, kind of this, right, every wicked problem is essentially unique, right, saying there might be important similarities, right, a heat wave in Pakistan might be like a heat wave in, I don't know, Afghanistan or India, but two alerts might still be different, right? There might be different vulnerabilities, START fund might have different money, there might be different operational presence on the ground. So even though you can draw some conclusions from previous alert, it's never the same, right? It's never like, oh, we've done this before, let's do it again. Even more, they kind of have this sort of characteristic where every problem may be a symptom of yet a deeper problem, right? So, and you sort of can keep on going down this list, right? There's multiple explanations for all wicked problems, and sort of the other thing is no corroboration is possible, right? And that comes a little bit back to this expertise, right? Where sort of the traditional story of science is, well, you sort of follow a certain methodology, and then if you follow the methodology, even though your results might be wrong, right? You're not to blame because there's things you stuff know and we never really know, right? The right answer is always you're always trying to refute, right? and we are aware of that. But in the start fund, right, they're expected to get this right. Right? It's not like, well, there's things we didn't know. It's less excusable to get things wrong, generally speaking. So, you know, in a wicked world, how does one proceed, right? And sort of basically the way we proceeded in this project was sort of, you know, a mix and match approach, right? We sort of tried different things, we tried different pieces, and we basically proceeded by trial and error. And always keep in mind, right, that there's so many repercussions and recursive effects that, you know, you can never have sort of the full picture. And so this is very rough, but right, sort of you have different models or pictures of decision making. You sort of have rational actor model, behavioral models, intuition models, phenomenological models, and narrative models. And they sort of have different properties. And you sort of, for different problems, sorry. I also have one of those darn colds. For different problems, you think about, okay, which model is applicable here? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And then you sort of proceed step by step. Now, then really, you know, having said all of this, you know, what can academia offer? And now, I don't want to push this metaphor too far, but I do think it has some applicability. It's sort of right where the academic expert is a little bit like the therapist, right? Where you come in and you sit down with lots of people and you say, well, what do you think the problems in your organization are? What do you think the goals of your organization should be? What do those mean? How do you accomplish those goals? And then you engage in a back and forth, right? And engage them, do you think this is the right way of accomplishing the goal? Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought that? And what I have found, or taken away, is that there's a lot of pressure emotionally that practitioners often have the feeling they should have the answer, right? Not having the answer is a both intellectual and emotional failing on their part, right? But actually helping convince them that there cannot be no answer. And it's not the fact that, you know, you have to have an answer before you have to have an action, but you have to sort of act, and you will always act with limited information. And the question becomes, how can your actions improve over time, right? Which is a very different problem from getting the right actions, right? And another thing, right, sort of to come back is I see it as you help organizations find that conviction, right? Be like, this is sort of the best you could do given this time frame. But then there's the best thing, right? Then the question becomes, maybe the time frame needs to be expanded, right? Do we really have to do it in 72 hours? Could we do it in 80 hours? Could we do it in 90 hours, right? What would be, if we play around with them, what would that allow us? And would actually changing some of those organizational constraints allow the organization to better accomplish some of the goals they set themselves? But in sort of a weird way, I also think, you know, organizations can be a therapist for academia, because in some ways, right, they kind of help us to dispel some of the illusions we have in our amusement park of optimal choices, right? It's not, you know, you don't just run a simple, I don't know, regression and they be like, well, that's the answer. And then they're like, well, that's not an answer to anything, right? That's not even a question I ask, right? How do we actually do this? So I also actually think there's this interesting relationship where working with practitioners on the ground makes us better academics, right? It helps us use our skills in sort of different and better ways, right? Now, my takeaway for some of the things that shouldn't be done, right, is you can't be the point that, and I think there is a tendency of this, and there's also sometimes a wish for this, right, where the practitioner, well, with this really difficult example, we don't know, should we do more on famine or should we do more on floods, right, that you bring in an academic expert and the academic expert tells you what to do, right? Because you can't really take over the goals of the organization. It's not your organization, it's their organization, right? And so, and there's also, you have to resist that wish that in fact you can tell them what to do, right? And I think one of the things we've talked about, right, is there is this tendency and wish that you could just defer to a higher authority, right? That you can avoid responsibility by saying, well, the scientist said we should do X, so we do X, right? Because these are really thorny questions, right? And also, bless you. Thank you. Also think it's important, right, to help organizations understand there isn't one singular solution, right? There are different kinds of solutions to different kinds of things, and also bearing in mind that an organization is not a static thing, right? It sort of changes over time. And then there's the question, well, the organization does X, but maybe the organization should be doing Y, right? How do you help the organization sort of change and transform differently? Also, you know, one of the things, or another thing, right, that sort of is important for me, it's you can't really start as if you like starting from scratch, right? So you're not coming in from as an academic and be like, okay, if I designed a rapid response humanitarian organization, what would it look like? And then I draw it up, and then I go to the organization and I say like, okay, this is what I've come up with, this is how we're changing it, right? This is not what's going to work, right? You need to take these sort of existing organizational frameworks into account, and then think about how can we take the existing organizational frameworks and sort of move them forward to get to something we have decided upon. And then obviously, yeah, the other sort of two things follows, right? I mean, I've talked about this a little bit, and I think, you know, this emotional side is really very important, is I think generally underappreciated, right? Kind of both the time pressures, you know, people that start are under, you know, they have to do this very, very quick, they have to find local experts, they have to convene these rota meetings, they have to get people to respond. It's very dicky and it's very, very difficult, right? So the question of how do they emotionally cope with all the stress that is thrown of them is something, you know, that needs to be considered and often falls out. And then there are obviously these sort of effects, right? What are the expectations that the incentives or structures within an organization implicitly and explicitly puts on their employees, right? Maybe some of them, how do they treat if an employee gets something wrong, right? If, well, we should do this alert, it didn't turn out all like we expected, what will happen, right? Are they sort of supportive in that culture or not? And I think these are very important questions, but obviously they're very difficult to change, right? It's very, very difficult to change an organizational culture. So you have to be aware of it, but it doesn't mean that, you know, everything has to stay as is, because, you know, change often does take place. And also just thinking about that, all this uncertainty and this thing, you know, this both has emotional and organizational costs, right? I mean, we've heard about this a couple of times, but not acting is also action, right? And so you have to think about it, you know, what exactly is this when basically, you know, avoiding of action, you know, it seems like at first, and I think there's a fair amount of, you know, in the humanitarian sector, that seems like one way in which you can avoid uncertainties, right? You just don't do anything, and then you pretend the problem doesn't exist. But then there's also other ways of avoiding uncertainty, and part of our project was, you know, getting, obviously, if you want to act, you have to sort of keep it in mind, and I think, you know, Richard talked about this weird duality that on the one hand you have to be aware of all the uncertainty, on the other hand you have to have enough conviction to act, right? So how do you accomplish this? And I think there was a certain amount of feeling that, at least in some senses, there were too many mechanisms to avoid the true nature of the uncertainty people at start face, right? And sort of what sort of we identified was, you know, oftentimes, and we even saw it on one of the previous slides that Melina presented, right? That you create kind of unsubstantiated data, right? Like 162,848 people were affected, and you're like, where does this number come from? And then, you know, just somebody kind of, well, we take this village and we take this village. We don't really know about this village, but we'll take okay, that will roughly do. And then you ask, like, and what does it mean that they were affected? Did it mean that one of their uncles was in one of those villages? Or you saw that there were very different definitions of what affected means for different crises across different geographies. But obviously the ability to write down one number sort of gave the impression that you really knew what was happening, right? And so one of the push we read that we sort of tried to move away from these very precise numbers and possibly move towards ranges, right? So, and ranges being showing that, well, there's both uncertainty about, you know, what really counts as affected, but then there's also uncertainty what really happen, right? And obviously the wider the range, sort of the more uncertainty you should have. So in certain ways we sort of move towards that. Now, another way is sort of, right, and that's, I mean, there's advantages to decentralized decision making, there's also disadvantages, right? One, the ability to easily sort of avoid the emotional cost of having made a wrong decision. So trying to think about how can we increase more ownership of decisions, right? How can we allow the people in the fund, in both sort of stages of the process, sort of feel really responsible for the decisions they have taken. And we have taken some of the rest. And then another thing I just want to sort of touch upon sort of as last point, that for me it's really about, humanitarian being given all the different things they do, given all the things, it's really sort of about building intuition, right? And that's just a sort of nice Gerd Gigerenzer quote, right? The generations of students in the social sciences have been opposed to entertaining lectures that point out how dumb everybody else is, constantly wandering off the path of logic and getting lost in the fog of intuition. Yet logical norms are blind to content and culture, ignoring involved capacities and environmental structure. Often what looks like a reasoning error from a purely logical perspective turns out to be a highly intelligent social judgment in the real world. Good intuition must go beyond the information given and therefore beyond logic, right? And sort of for the humanitarian sector, and for starters, like how can we help build good intuitions about what to do in given humanitarian crisis? How am I doing for time?
It's 20 past.
Okay. Maybe I'll wrap very quickly. So Sarah's going to go into this a little bit more, but I just want to give you a quick overview of some of the stuff we did. So, basically we sat down, or I sat down and I looked at previous decisions, right? Start fund discussions, had lots and lots of discussions, both inside START, with external consultant, with committee representative, with members of the network, and I sort of tried to get a good picture of what goes on at different parts in the process, and sort of what do practitioners feel as are problematic. Right? It's partly as a result of this. One of the things that kind of came out is that you obviously want to do decentralized decision making, and one of the reasons for doing so is because you have people have different informational bases, people have different expertise, and by being decentralized, you bring them together, you sort of get more than the sum of the parts, right? You kind of get a better decision. One of the tendencies that sort of was observed was that basically in the discussions, everybody else, because there's so many things going on, tended to defer to the person who they thought was most knowledgeable, right? And basically just whatever they said, they sort of went along with it. Which, if that happens, you clearly lose some of the advantages of decentralized decision making. So we actually, did a sort of Delphi-inspired simulation and then a trial to sort of try to avoid that by people basically having to submit written statements beforehand about what they thought should be done, which are then discussed, and there was a lot of reluctance. People just didn't want to do that. They didn't want to commit onto paper what they were going to say, what they were going to do. It felt them very, very uncomfortable. And then sort of in a simulation we tried this, which was very interesting. Sort of in the first round, sort of we had I think it was a hurricane in Cuba or Madagascar? Madagascar, I don't exactly. In the first round we say, what do you think should be done sort of in terms of resources needed, people affected. There was a variance of, I think, by a factor of 20. I mean, absolutely massive variance. And so we did a second round of discussions and the variance had completely disappeared. Right? And this is basically because everybody again deferred to the person who they thought would know, and sort of this was deferred, right? And then a question is, well, how can we keep some of the advantages of decentralized decision making if not, right? Then we also did some anticipation through various templates that are used in the alert process, right? Basically moving away from one future to possible different futures, amongst other things. We did some training sessions on learning and uncertainty, sort of trying to people help with that mindset of decision making. And we also sort of did some guidance notes that are from now on going to be used to train future START Fund Rota members and others. And with this, I think I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
All right, so we wanted to just very quickly walk you through some of the findings that were coming out of Toby's research. And basically what you see on the screen there is one page of a short document we have produced on navigating uncertainty. And so we summarize all of the research in 7 points that START Fund decision makers could keep in mind, and they could apply these principles to the decisions that they were making. So we really wanted to make this document digestible. We wanted to make it practical. To build off Toby's analogy, I think when the START network first started experimenting with academic partnerships, we didn't want a therapist. We wanted surgeons. So we wanted people to come in and fix our problems and perform this surgery and walk away, and then we're recovered. But we quickly found out that that is not the right way of proceeding, and so we sort of dropped this idea of this magic bullet solution. We stopped finding, or we stopped searching for the right expertise, the perfect tools to solve all of our problems,
And instead, we're encouraging our decision makers to embrace these 7 principles, because as Toby was saying, what we're finding is that in order to navigate uncertainty effectively, it's about a mindset. It's about a shift in mindset that we really want our decision makers to be embracing. And so this document is actually used to spark a discussion in every single decision-making ROTA induction. So these happen every 8 weeks, where we come together with the humanitarians who are going to be making the decisions about all of the alerts that are coming through the START Fund. And this group of decision makers, it changes every 8 weeks. So this is one of the conversations we're now having with those decision makers. So I'm going to quickly walk us through the 7 principles that have come out of this research. So the first thing that Toby flagged to us is that our decision makers are often using the words risk and uncertainty interchangeably. We don't necessarily differentiate these things, which don't lead to very strong decision making. So Toby encouraged us to clearly define and distinguish these 2 things. And so of course for risk, we know this refers to a situation where outcomes are known and can be understood in a probabilistic fashion. To put that in START Fund terms, examples which have probabilistic outcomes can include storm path predictions and perhaps flood predictions. So something like, in this state, we've got 80% chance of seeing tropical storm winds within the next 8 hours. We can understand this risk in probabilistic fashions, where uncertainty refers to situations where the outcomes just can't be known. And of course, most decisions about the future are uncertain. So we have a few scenario planning tools that we use to anticipate possible spikes in conflict and displacement. We had an alert, for example, anticipating potential conflict around the Kenya elections that just passed, and we ended up producing likely scenarios. It was interesting, one of the scenarios ended up unfolding to a T, and because our project based the scenario in mind, they're more effective. But what we didn't do was try to put percentages or probabilities on all of these scenarios, because there's too many interrelating factors, and that's not a helpful way about thinking about that problem. And so the recommendation that we're making to START Fund decision makers is in these meetings that you're having, try to distinguish problems that are related to risk and questions that are related to uncertainty, and don't try to find probabilities when we're discussing something that is uncertain, which I think actually really released our decision makers. I think sometimes we're running around for probabilities that just don't exist. Of course, we know in practice, most of the decisions that we are navigating, they involve a combination of risk and uncertainty, but of course we can separate these elements in the discussion that happens. The second thing Toby encouraged us to do is get away from this idea that there is a right or wrong answer when facing uncertainty. So sometimes we see our humanitarian decision makers putting a lot of pressure on themselves in these decision-making meetings to find the right solution, the right decision. And you could argue that in conditions of risks, there can be right answers to be found. But of course, under conditions of uncertainty, this just isn't going to be the case. We need to release ourselves of looking for the right answer when we're navigating uncertainty. And of course, a lot of the time, these right and wrong answers can only really become known in retrospect. So I think this has actually saved us a lot, or will save us a lot of time, and maybe will help us get away from some of those red herring conversations, looking for the right or wrong answer. And so the recommendation is just for our decision makers to get away from that narrative. The third thing Toby encouraged us to do was keep asking the question when you're reading alert notes. So these summaries of the risks or the crises that will eventually unlock START funds, is to ask the question, does the data in these alert notes adequately reflect the uncertainty involved? Decision makers should be continually asking this question, are we being transparent about the uncertainty here? Or are we trying to hide it in really precise numbers, or maybe percentages that don't really exist? So for example, if we're sharing a forecast, our members are being encouraged to be really transparent about that forecast. So here's the forecast, but the level of skill for this particular geographic area is very low, which means there's a very high level of uncertainty to do with this forecast. And so we're encouraging our members to be a lot more transparent with how they are presenting and reflecting data. Another principle is just encouraging our decision makers to be informed as much as possible. Now we know that all data information is fundamentally problematic to some extent, and even though the future cannot be known, this of course doesn't excuse our decision makers for trying to be as informed as possible. Sometimes, given our timelines, it can become very stressful, and decision makers can get overwhelmed, and they may come to these meetings without having digested the information. They may say things like, well, it's impossible to know everything anyway, so I'm not going to bother. I'm trying to read all these documents. And of course, that isn't a helpful way to approach these decisions. And so we're saying, as a bare minimum, you've got to read all of the start fund documents that we're providing. So the alert note, additional forecast information that we've produced, information that might be coming out of your organization. We also get a briefing note from ACAPS that sort of describes the situation. So as a bare minimum, everyone has to read that content before they come to these decisions. The next, fairly intuitive, but learning is key to dealing with uncertainty. And of course, over time, people learn from experience, and this enables them to judge uncertainty better. But in order to really foster the right mindset, to really embrace learning that comes from uncertainty, we're encouraging our decision makers to embrace 4 principles. The first is accept uncertainty for what it is. Second, take responsibility for your actions. Third, try your best to get things right, but be honest and open when things go wrong. So get away from this mindset where we fear organizational and reputational risks, so we cover up possible learnings, which is of course devastating for our work. And in order to learn, one needs to be confronted with the outcomes of one's decisions. So what we're doing here is we're having some very intentional conversations with decision makers about how they want the outcomes of their decisions to be presented back to them the next time they're on the decision-making rota. And so Sarah Barr and others from our learning team are coming up with a framework to present back some of the decisions that were made and some of the outcomes of those decisions. Of course, it's really important to remember that things are complex. There's a variety of very complex factors interconnecting on the ground, so oftentimes presenting back learning isn't necessarily as clear-cut as we think, but we're really wanting to make a step towards presenting back information and outcomes to our decision makers in a more intentional way. The next principle is not all decision making is rules-based. So we are seeing in the humanitarian sector a lot of work and conversations about automating humanitarian funding. So, for example, some of the parametric insurance work that's taking place, and this is really exciting. But of course, we also know that a lot of research research is suggesting that a lot of decisions aren't necessarily rule-bound. So sometimes we see our decision makers applying rules or rigidities in their decision making that can lead to worse decision making. So they may say, last time when we discussed this alert about DRC, these were the rules that we put in place. We decided to spread out our funding and spend less on each beneficiary, but we got more coverage. So we've got to do that again. And it's not always helpful to reapply these set of rules. Instead, we want a real rich facilitated discussion to be kind of steering these decisions, not hard rules that aren't necessarily helpful. We're also encouraging our decision makers to differentiate good and bad bias. So we had this really, I think, not helpful way of thinking about bias as, all bias are really, really bad, and we need to not make decisions using bias in any way. But Toby very gently reminded us that the only way to completely make unbiased decisions is to pick decisions in a very random way. So we stopped being so harsh on bias, and we've started to embrace that actually some biases are very beneficial to the goals of the START network. So for example, we seek to be biased towards crises that aren't getting media attention. We seek to be biased towards the most vulnerable community members. We seek to be biased towards speed. And so instead of just throwing out this concept, we're encouraging our decision makers to differentiate what's a good and what's a bad bias. An example of a bad bias, meaning I'm coming to a decision with my Save the Children hat on, which means I'm going to vote for Save the Children projects. I'm not coming as a humanitarian. So really encouraging our members to differentiate. Great, so those are the principles, and we just actually published this document really recently, so we're kind of in this phase where we're launching it with the network and really starting to use this research to kind of start conversations with our decision makers, and we're really, I think, excited and feeling positive about where it's going.
Okay, thank you.